It's a pleasure to be here. So this is what I want to talk about. Some people have thought that when you favor labor standards and various forms of fair trade, you're, quote, against globalization. I think the evidence is exactly the opposite. The people I'm arguing with include both sides of this debate. So I give the various people, some of whom I assume were involved in the famous marches or protests during the trade agreements here in Seattle. And then I called them advocates, the other group is advocates of unfettered globalization. It's almost every trade economist I know. There's not a trade economist who seems to have any second doubts about things. IFI are the international financial institutions. That's the World Bank, the IMF, and so on. And there are a whole bunch of other folks. And they seem to have one agreement, is that it's either you have standards or you have globalization. The people who advocate the standards use these words low road, and the Europeans use the word social dumping. The idea is you can't keep high standards if you're competing with countries with low standards. And we'll see, I don't think that's right. And the other guys feel that somehow or other, if you're favoring standards, what you're really trying to do is give protection to our workers and harm the workers in the developing countries, who can only produce, goods, low-wage goods that'll be low-priced. I mean, that's what their relative advantage is. Okay, so I say both sides are wrong, and I have some hair, so that's not me without my hat. It turns out, because the advocates of all these standards and the fair trade tend to be do-gooders. I was just with a group of them here at the university earlier this afternoon, and various students and members of the administration and professors who, they're not garment workers. There was no one there who will be a garment worker, period. And there are now largely because I think of immigration of low-skilled people, we do have some garment trade in the US and in Los Angeles and New York and elsewhere of immigrants. But still, it's a tiny part of our workforce, and that's not what it's about. And then we should all remember that these do-gooders, when they are speaking for standards, at least some of my more conservative friends say, oh, it's really just secret protectionism there. In fact, when people want protectionism, they just say so. When George Bush protected the steel industry, remember, he put in some quick protective tariffs in order to get votes in, I think, West Virginia and Pennsylvania before one set of elections. He called it protectionism. He didn't hide it. And union leaders, if they're going to protect their members by raising tariffs, they'll be proud of that. They're not going to hide this. So this is to view it as hidden protectionism, I think, is silly. And then for the race to the bottom, I'll give you some evidence that labor standards have been rising. They've risen faster during the period of globalization than they have risen, I'll say ever before, but at least they've risen very fast. Since I don't really have data going back, multiple years for this. Okay, so this gives you what I'm going to talk about. And then on the right is a thing that we should all remember. People in the world, starting with the Americans as being believe mostly that these standards should be part of trade things. And then you go down and people in India and people in China, the majority of people want standards. Now this is not a question that I wrote. And I would have written a question about labor standards sort of irrespective of trade. And, but the only question I could find that's internationally the same across, across these countries had to do with trade. Because I think you get stronger views, particularly in the third world countries, if you just said, do you want some good labor standards in your country? Whereas obviously if you're in India or Mexico, Philippines, whatever, you will think, well, gee, if the standards go up, it's going to be more costly. Maybe we will lose some jobs, which is the fear that people have, but even so, you see the vast majority of people. So this is not something that's being fostered onto people in different countries that they themselves don't want. Okay, and you can just see what the talk's going to be about. What are the standards people typically talk about? And there are a set of core standards that pretty much every country in the world has signed up to. There's part of ILO conventions. Freedom from forced labor. We don't believe in slavery. Freedom from discrimination. And that's a pretty new standard. You go back to the 50s or 60s in this country when they added the clause about you shouldn't discriminate against women as part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That was added as a joke, because of course you discriminated against women. And until then, discrimination against blacks, against Irish, if you want to have a sign that said no Irish need apply, Jews, whatever group it was legal in lots of states in the country. Lots of states it wasn't. I don't know where Washington stands, but I would assume you were one of the states that already outlawed this. Most of the northern states and the West Coast states did. But the South, it was completely legal. Freedom from child labor is a very interesting one, since they then modify that always. And so here it's starting with the worst form. And the fear is always that if you have no child labor, okay, what are you going to have the children do? If what you're going to do is kick them out of the factory and they're going to go to the street, they're going to be presumably poorer and worse off. So you have to have some program or something to make sure that they're better off and not worse off. So these are not like, what's the word, crazy standards, if I could phrase it right. They're very, very sensible. And then the one that I think is really the controversial one is the freedom of association, which means the right to unionize. And that is controversial because, in truth, many firms do not want that, period. And the fact that countries have signed up to it and they have a law about it, they still do not want that. And so that's probably the most difficult one, I think, there is. But everybody has signed up to these things. I distinguish those from these cash standards, which we can argue about, I think. And different countries have to figure out what minimum wage they want. I'm going to give you some evidence a little bit about minimum wages. Whether we have a living wage and how you define that is questionable, and obviously it does depend critically. A living wage in the advanced country is different than a living wage in Bangladesh. It just has to be. And the other things here. So those are standards, but they're not the heart of, I think, what's going on. So that's the standards. What makes this a global market, and why it is really consistent with or complementary with globalization? As an economist, I'm going to come just to the basic point that consumers are willing to pay more for a product that they know is made under reasonably good conditions, which we can worry about exactly how we define reasonably good conditions. We've done surveys which show very clearly that if I tell you I've got a T-shirt here and it's made by children who are being beaten in a Gap factory in India, that no one here, I don't know, maybe one person will, I don't know, but not too many people here presumably will buy that product. Most people say they won't buy it under any circumstance. And then I sometimes like to say, under no circumstance, I'll give you $100 to buy it. And somebody might, $200. I've got $1 million check here. Well, we understand that at some point, many people will buy it at that point. But of course, that's not the world we're living in, where people are offering you $1 million to buy a product made under horrible conditions. Generally, and most firms, the Gap, as you may know, when the minute that came out that one of their subcontractors had let things out to where it was literally child labor slavery, instantly reacted. Because they know that would be if that got widely thing, they thought that this is what they permitted. So we have this. The low standards are risky to multinationals. Nike, which is now widely regarded as one of the best companies in this world, every time there were protests of students and other groups against them when they were not a good person in this world, their share price fell. And you would see these newspaper stories that would say it was Phil Knight, I think that's the name of the man who heads Nike, or he just lost, $10 million today in his share prices because of this. And then you started to figure, how much does it cost to clean up some of the violations that were found? And it turns out peanuts. It's not that expensive in general. Shareholders have spoken. And it can even be dangerous to a country if they're known as a low standards country. CalPERS at various times has said they're not going to invest in your country, and so forth. And I put at the bottom, I think is the key thing, the pressure for standards in part comes from globalization. It's because we now buy the products, wear the products, consume the products made overseas. We don't want to feel that what we're buying, wearing, or consuming is made under terrible conditions. So we want to know some information about that. And without globalization, well, Bangladesh would just take care of itself. But now they sell to us, and they have to worry about these things. So who is in this market? Again, this is a very economics-oriented view. Well, they're the people agitators. I call them human rights vigilantes. They're out there campaigning. They have to find out what's going on, and they raise these campaigns. Nike's doing bad things. They had an interesting campaign which failed completely. They had Catholic nuns marching in front of Disney headquarters. Disney was paying children in Haiti, I don't know, 1 cent an hour, some absolutely obscene amount of money. And Disney, they just couldn't get consumers worked up about Mickey Mouse. And I have these little buttons that say, don't buy Mickey Mouse. Didn't work. So these agitators have to find the right message to deliver on the right companies, the right products, and at the right time to get consumers worked up. There are governments all over that are involved in this. The labor ministries in developing countries are usually the weakest ministries in those countries. And one obvious way you could improve standards is if you strengthen those ministries so they became more effective and efficient. And the advanced country policies, one interesting thing about the Bush administration is in our free trade agreements, they have kept in the labor clauses that we began putting in Cambodia and so on. So even an administration that you don't regard as particularly friendly to labor has stuck with these things as part of our policies. The workers and unions, the multinationals. At the bottom, it all depends on the consumers. Because if the consumers will shun the products made under bad conditions and willing to pay a little bit more for the products made under good conditions, a company that has no morality will look and say, it's more profitable to make things under good conditions, therefore I'll do it. And that I think is absolutely fundamental. So now we have a question. And when I first began working in this area, I did these surveys. And of course, some economists in particular, but anybody can reasonably say, oh, you did a survey that said how much people said they would pay extra for a product made under good conditions. We were a little more subtle about the way we did it, but basically that's what we did. And maybe that's not true. And in some of the social science literature, that's called a stated choice. I mean, they told you what they would do, and we didn't observe what they actually would do. And then I put in brackets, but it's hard to convince my economics friends about this, and in any case, it's better to have real choice in any case. But there's a whole body of literature, particularly in marketing, that says stated choice is really very good. People, we've seen the polls and the stated choice is some of these poll questions before an election, and we've seen they can miss the things for various reasons, and they're always confused, but generally they work. Generally they give you a pretty good idea of what's going on. So the same thing is here. These activists wouldn't be in business if they couldn't have some successes, so we see that. The companies respond, that's another sign that the only reason the companies are doing it is because they fear that the consumers are going to pay attention. And then I said the share prices. So there's a lot of evidence that just says, yeah, well, why is everybody paying attention to this if it isn't that consumers won't buy the products under bad conditions, et cetera? We had great success. We had the Pope was lined up in the Drop the Debt campaigns with things. So, and all of which was based on consumers. No country wanted to relent on debt owed to them by some third world country, except that their own citizens basically said, do it. And it was very, very, very strong. Okay. But now you may not trust these things about the consumers, so we have a set of experiments. And these are done by government professor Michael Hiscox at Harvard and a former student of mine, Nick Smith, who was the undergraduate who worked on this, et cetera. And I'm going to give you their experimental evidence from these stores in New York, towels and candles. And what they did was they labeled one of the brand as being made under good conditions with a nice label, and the other brand was the control. And then you would see what would happen. So now I'm just going to give you the evidence from this. I think this is the best experiments we have at this time. This was the label they made for the candles. Fair and square. Well, I don't know, yeah. I mean, you might have said fair and cool or something, or I don't know what. But that's what they did. And then they said fair labor conditions, safe environment, free of discrimination, etc. It's interesting that they didn't say anything about respects unionization issues, etc. And it might be interesting if they had made that a major thing. Would that have had a differential effect? I don't know. But they also had to bargain with the company, and who knows the details of that bargaining. These are the results for towels and candles. And I'll show you first just look at the towels evidence. The baseline is, where they didn't have any labels. Then they labeled one of the items. And you see, gee, not much effect. Doesn't look like the labeling had much impact at all. Then they labeled it, and they raised the price. The units sold is the pinkish line, and the blue is the revenues. So what you quickly got the message was, I put a label on, and I'm not raising the price. The consumers are sitting there thinking, well, yeah, what's going on here? That you must not be doing anything. You must not be delivering something to the workers or whoever it is in the countries. You have to raise the price. Now, to a company, that's good information. So now I do better if I raise my price and I put the label on. Of course, then you have the danger that I put a label on and I don't do anything and I collect the money and put it in my pocket. So you need somebody to monitor this labeling process, and you have to monitor it carefully. So that's this 3 is where they raised the price 10%. Then you see they raised it 20%. They're still selling some more units, and they're still getting more profit, of course, if they're selling more units at a higher price. So they didn't do is check at what point did the raising the price begin to reduce demand. And so my guess is, given the way this is going, somewhere around 25–30% price rise, people would have said, I'm not going to pay that much for this labeled product. Then you see return to the baseline, and then they show you the so it's a sort of a before. Then you add it, then you return to this Christie's label, and then on the right it shows you what the other brand, what the control brand was over the period. The candles experiment makes economists feel better. And the reason it makes us feel better is you'll see that it's here line 4 where they say the 20% increase in the price of the candles, you see the number of units really falls. So at least we get a downward sloping demand curve for the response. But essentially it's the same thing. People are willing to pay 10, 20%, and maybe even a little bit more in these cases for items that they know are made under good conditions. And that's sort of the margin within which the activists can work. I think they know you can't, it's like a minimum wage. You can raise a minimum wage a certain amount. In Washington, I think minimum wage got a lot of attention a while ago compared to Idaho. But obviously, if you raise the minimum wage, fivefold, so people would get $35 an hour, there'd be a lot of people losing their jobs. So we understand you can't. The trick is to find out how much you can work in these different margins. And here it looks like you can work fairly well. Okay, but before I go to the next one, let me just say, Michael and a different student have been selling, or they've been auctioning off coffee on eBay. And they're finding very similar results to this. And they're doing so well that the graduate student may be leaving graduate school, yes, to set up a company that will be selling fair standard, fair labeled items on the internet. And I said to Michael, I said, don't you want to be rich too? And he said, no, I'm happy being a professor. But nonetheless, I thought, maybe we could sell shares of this company, and so on. But so this has been replicated. These kinds of results have been replicated in other things, and I think they can be replicated just almost any place. I think it does reflect a very real thing, that if people feel the product is made under good conditions, they'll pay a bit more. One of the reasons why standards and trade are complements is, here I give the gap experiment, the natural experiment that showed you, right? So on the left, it's a report on what was going on, and obviously written by a popular person, not an academic article. And when the gap had been caught in this way. And then the gap's response is on the right. And this just would never have happened if those items were not being sold in our country. In our country, I speak not the U.S., I mean all of the outside traded world. Europe responds sometimes more than we do, Japan, Australia, etc. I mean, it's all of us. One terrible thing about this particular thing is what the Gap then did, however, was not what any activist would have wanted them to do. They just cut off the contract and got the kids fired. Or perhaps the subcontractor found some other company that was willing to do the subcontracting to them. So this sadly did not improve, as far as we can see, the lives of the kids who were caught in this situation. And it could have been. But they reacted extraordinarily rapidly, and they were just panicked in some sense. They said, oh my God, you don't want your whole brand to be destroyed. But only would have happened if it was because of the trade. So without globalization, this would not have been there. This shows these ILO conventions. And I said there are the four big standards, but the ILO has lots and lots of conventions. And I suppose here I've got 7 of them, I think. Different colors, and it shows you the growth of countries joining these conventions. 1989 is essentially before the globalization really, I think, takes off, because that's before India and China join, and before the collapse of the Soviet Union, or just about when the Soviet Union's collapsing. And then it goes up to 2001, and you just see this huge increase in the number of countries adopting these standards. The child labor standard went up from 45 to 106. That is the fastest signing up of countries to a standard we've ever had. Now, the fact that you signed up does not mean you enforce anything, but it is a statement of that your country now has some legal obligation to do something, and then the question becomes, how do we implement this? So the idea that the low road was going to, everybody's going to buy out of standards is not true. This is one other issue. This on the bottom is the number of conventions ratified, and along the other axis is the per capita income of countries. Because one of the claims of people who who believe this is all secret protectionism is it's all the advanced countries forcing things down India and China and so on down their throats. We already saw that most people in India and China want the standards with the trade. So that tells us one piece of evidence. And I think the key thing to note here, if you look at 7, which is the most of these conventions signed, is there's a wide range of countries of income levels. It isn't just, the US and Singapore are the weirdos. We don't sign very many standards because we don't have to, we're such great guys. And I have no idea why Singapore doesn't, but they may have a similar attitude to us. We also don't sign some of these standards, as you may know. We've had troubles with the ILO when the communist trade unions were treated as real trade unions. The AFL-CIO had problems, and so we've been a very uneasy thing. I give the correlations here, and if you include the US, the correlation with income is 0.09, which is pretty modest, but there is a positive correlation. And if you leave us and Singapore out, it's 0.22. There is I mean, the higher income countries tend to do more, but the fact is everybody has something, including low income countries. Now, one of the claims against standards was that they would reduce the speed of economic development. So it really was going to hurt me if India or China, have better standards, because it's going to force me to raise the cost of production, the multinationals will go elsewhere, my products will be higher priced. And we do know of companies that will say, wages in Bangladesh are a lot lower than in China. And they'll say, I'm moving to Bangladesh, et cetera. But in fact, there's been a whole bunch of academic studies. They find no relation, on average, between these core labor standards, it's CLS there, and comparative advantage. There's not even any evidence that the countries that get more investment from the West grow faster or slower. Countries that actually do a lot of their savings themselves do very well without our putting investment in. And then there are reasons to think that some of these standards actually improve economic growth. The children to school, the reduced gender discrimination. If you have less discrimination, you open the doors for another half of your workforce to produce productively. Then I decided the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, which is the sort of World Bank for the Latin America, they've both concluded, even if they go to freedom of association and have unions, there's no evidence that this harms anything. I did some regressions. I don't think I give my regressions here. I think this is enough to maybe I do. We'll see in the next slide, do I? No, I don't. I didn't think I did. But I took some measures and just say, well, is there any evidence that across lots of countries that labor standards are negatively correlated with growth? No, there isn't. But there is evidence that a whole lot of other things that conservative economists like are indeed positively correlated with growth. You don't want to have a lot of inflation. I think Zimbabwe is heading to the basket case. You do want to have free markets. Yes, the more freer your markets are. You do want to be involved in the global system in some fashion or other. All of you take an index of all those things, they are positively correlated with growth. But labor issues turn out not to be. The reason is, I think, because what labor does is largely shift some of the returns from capitalism to workers. It doesn't harm the productivity of capitalism. And I believe that was the view of Harry Bridges, in whom this thing is named. Yeah, and ultimately you're shooting the workers and yourself in the foot if you're doing anything that really reduces productivity and reduces maybe some short-run gains, but in the long run, you don't want to do that. You want the system to be as productive as humanly possible. You just want to make sure you get a fair share. And that's largely what unions and these labor laws are meant to do. They're not meant to reduce productivity, and be inefficient. And the regressions seem to show that. So I think the big problem is implementing standards. You have them. Almost all these countries have signed up to them. Many companies have given their corporate standards. And I just said, fighting greed and corruption is hard. Well, there's money to be made by cheating. I already told you the labor ministries are poorly funded. One of the more weakly enforced countries in the world is our own. We have very few people, and the current Department of Labor probably is the weakest it's ever been in the history, since you go back, I don't know till when. There's never been a more irrelevant labor ministry. If you actually do counts of how many people they have trying to enforce minimum wage laws or whatever it is, it's just tiny numbers you come up with. I haven't looked at numbers of late. But when I did look, they were small, and that was under maybe 10 years ago. They're going to be smaller today. A lot of governments in the third world fear independent unions. And they fear them because of what? Because the unions actually will help bring about a more free market and open system. Solidarnosc, the one thing the Chinese fear, they don't want a free trade union, is they have a phobia about Solidarnosc. That somehow or other, if they have free unions, those unions are going to turn out the communist dictatorship and create a free market. And a free democratic country. Companies fear independent monitors for some of the same reasons. You don't want these things. And then probably the most serious thing, though, is cheating is pretty easy. And any stories you have about how monitoring things, you monitor the factory one day, the next day things go back to what they were before they knew you were going to monitor them, you were going to come in. I've been to factories, US factories, where the cheating was kind of sensible in one sense. That's what it was explained to me by the union, this is UAW and General Motors. So people, these are reputable guys. So the company has certain standards about what they're doing. And then I'd go to the factory and I would look around and I'd say, well, gee, all the men are segregated in one area and all the women are in other areas. And I thought that was one of the company things they were not supposed to do. And the factory manager, the union leader said, look, the guys want to talk about sports and the ladies don't want to talk about that. And we find it's more productive if we just let them, be separate. And of course they said when somebody comes from central headquarters or from EEOC, we tell them to mix up. And you just say, okay, that's, but there I think the quote cheating is not harmful, but it could be cheating that is harmful, that is also easy to do. And so I put down here, sometimes non-enforcement can be optimal. Maybe it's just in everybody's interest we ignore these rules. I'm sure this university has many silly rules that everybody ignores whenever they can. It's just, you have to make some decisions about that. Now I want to tell you about one standard that I was stunned at to find out how well it is enforced in developing countries, and therefore represents something when you think about the cash standards, it's potentially enforceable through pressure from us as well. This is minimum wages. I must say I believed that the minimum wages were largely not enforced in developing countries. And I think when I would say this at various meetings, the World Bank, all places, nobody would really complain. I would say, well, mostly they're enforced against the big multinationals, but when you get into your informal sector and so on, not enforced. Then there came a series of studies in the last, I'd say 5-6 years from the World Bank in large part, which show, a spike means that a lot of the people are being paid right about the minimum wage. And so we see some data in the formal sector, which you'd believe, okay, that means they're enforced in the formal sector. And you have before and after. So you see, what was the minimum wage in 1995? They changed the minimum wage to 1998, and we'd see the spike of the distribution move. So it'd be a big, bunch of people at the minimum wage. Now that seems pretty clear, in the formal sector. The shock was finding that in the informal sector, where the law does not apply, the same spike would occur, and it would move just as much. I mean, to me, that's mind-boggling. And then I first saw this in a thesis of a woman in Britain, UCL, University College London, and I must admit, her thesis passed, and she has gotten a good job and so on, but I didn't sell the work as the way I should have, because I was vaguely suspicious. I said, oh, this just sounds a little odd. And now, speaking negatively of myself on this, now that the World Bank has had like about 6 or 7 studies, I now feel, yes, she was right. And so, her name is Sarah Lemos. I always want to, every time I talk to her, I say, read Sarah's work on this, because she was really, she may not have been the first, but she certainly was the first that did a very serious PhD thesis that did it. And I was kind of not fully sold, as you might not be sold by one study. And in the Brazilian literature, they even have a name for this, El Faro, which it's a light, it's a what do you call it? Yeah, yes. And the nature is you set a signal to the whole society that this is the wage that people should be getting. And the informal sector workers who have neighbors who are formal sector workers, they all say, well, that's what we should be getting. And we can think of the same thing as operating in the standards that are put on how your factory should operate. I mean, I don't know of any study that just looked at if we got standards in some Nike factory. Now that Nike's the great good guy in this world, though they spill over to other factories in the area, because the workers say, well, Nike's doing this right. I happen to be working at a different company, you working at Nike, why don't I get the same protections or so on? And I refer to myself here, which gives references to all of this minimum wage, literature and the number of studies. It's very compelling, and it really, let me just say, it goes against what economists originally thought. So we originally thought you put a minimum wage in the formal sector, they reduce employment, the workers go to the informal sector, and that depresses wages in the informal sector. And you can make the same argument on these standards being put in. Okay, the Nike puts the standards in their factory, they hire fewer people because it's more expensive, and then those workers go off to the other place. And that was one of the major, at least neoclassical economic complaints about the fair trade kinds of things, that it really was going to harm the workers in the worst part of the income distribution. Well, the evidence on the minimum wage is no. Instead, it actually sort of establishes a general economy-wide standard. It's very surprising. Now, I think where we stand now with this, if you accept these arguments or the evidence, I think the evidence is overwhelming at this point, is how do you do this along a supply chain, and can you find innovative ways to do this? Hopefully people will think about that kind of stuff. I keep thinking of, boy, you've got internet. These Chinese workers are incredibly interneted up. They're sort of one of the lead countries in this, even though the government tries to monitor certain things on the internet and keep you from so on. You have hotlines. Workers could just report, send in an email, anonymous email of some sort, to some government or private agency that you'd be able to, because it's very hard for you to go monitor and enforce. So you got to rely really on the workers to do this, and they could report things. Obviously, it's very successful. You could look at companies and you say, do you make part of your incentive pay or promotion depend that you are trying to enforce company codes of conduct? If it is part of the pay of the plant manager, or it is part of the contract written with the supplier, suddenly there's a monetary incentive for them to do this. And if there isn't, the incentive is to cheat. Because I can always say, oh gee, I'll fob off some of the work to this horrible factory with the kids. That's what in the Gap case, it wasn't their immediate subcontractor. It was their subcontractor who had subcontracted to somebody else, which obviously made more money for them. And so you want to be able to say, no, we pay you for this. Well, it makes sense to focus on the worst things. The other group you think should be involved in this are local community groups, who also presumably could have some knowledge and should have some. And again, the internet just makes it possible to connect us and groups here with groups there. Certified labels is obviously a very important, but what's the word? It has to be worked out on that. And then I thought of bounty hunters. What would happen if somebody announced that for every violation you find of things in a Nike factory, we pay you $5,000? Well, some people would go out. It's the same way we do bounty hunters to find somebody who broke their bail. Bounty hunters go out. Nobody's tried that. It would be a great and interesting experiment. Because the problem might be that some factory, some subcontractor of, I don't know, Nike or the Gap, would immediately cheat and report themselves and then, correct it. So it'd have to be worked on carefully so that it would operate. And then I put question marks because I don't know what creative ideas other people have. I think that's the issue, is how can we, in a modern world where we have internet, we have all kinds of things, can we figure out better ways to enforce this stuff? Or it's not just enforce, it's just get improvements rolling along the line. And then I said, we're always going to find that they break the standards. There's always going to break the law. And we have to understand that, particularly if you have a label, that the label does not mean that the product is made under good conditions. It means somebody is trying to, and somebody else feels that they're trying hard enough that they got the label. There'll always be somebody who might be cheating across the way. That's just the way it is. Okay, now I want to talk about the biggest change in standards we've had in the world, and the one that is maybe it's going to lead into something Nelson's going to talk about tomorrow. First, I quoted Napoleon, and he was not referring to labor standards. But China went through a big process of introducing this new labor law, which took effect on January 1 of this year. And the law there were versions of it. And what is amazing to me is the extent to which globalization affected their national labor law. First of all, the US Chamber of Commerce in China spoke in as strongly as they conceivably could to make the law weak and toothless. They did not want China to have a decent labor standards law because they felt it was going to cut into their profits. The European Chamber of Commerce also spoke that way, but the European unions and the European citizenry forced the European Chamber of Commerce in China, this is the chamber to reverse their position. The American Chamber won a lot of weakened things, and they finally did enact this law on June 29th. And you can ask why the Chinese government was interested in improving labor standards in China if the more conservative economists were right. This is going to hurt their comparative advantage, and they're going to lose sales to the rest of the world. Well, China's got a lot of social problems that you may or may not see written up in the papers. If you pay attention, you'll see. There was just the most recent one was, I don't know, it's usually 10,000 people every year die in mine disasters. And there's a new minister of whatever it is, health and safety and occupational health and safety in China who's pledging he's going to do something. Well, he's got to learn the only thing he probably will work will be to have some freer trade unions and have them organize the mines. That may work. It also may not work that well, but they have. So I just put all their things, and they are looking upon higher labor standards and worker rights as an insurance against the society exploding at some point because the inequality will have reached horrific things. I don't think China has any chance of exploding as long as they run, they're having an economic growth rate of 9 or 10%. But give China 1 or 2 years of a 1% growth rate, and I think the whole society would start wobbling in a very serious way. And what I think may not be that important, but that is the views of the Communist Party. They think their hold on power is not as strong as we might otherwise think. Well, this is, I already told you about the American Chamber of Commerce and also there was the US-China Business Council and the EU, they objected. And look at the complaints that were being made by them when they wanted to put these higher standards in. Companies will have to have human resources capability in the country. So that means that the Western countries would have to have the same sorts of internal human resources divisions that while they work for the company are basically there to make sure the company, they want to, they're meant to help workers. Not so that they harm profits, of course. And they don't have that, a lot of this. They haven't put this kind of stuff in. And then they worried about the union in this thing. This is the response, and again, it's a globalization response. So I've never met Professor Chang, even though he spoke at Harvard at my program, because I was somewhere else when he spoke. But he came to the US, I don't know if he spoke at the Harry Bridges Center, but I'm sure he spoke somewhere on the West Coast, lobbying for us, namely to help him counter the foreign corporations lobby. So the Chinese labor law was passed in part with lobbying from both sides. So I put down all the groups that were involved, and the Democrats in the Congress wrote a letter to Bush protesting. I'm sure he sent that off to his Justice Department, and or maybe he sent it off to somebody in Guantanamo and said, "What does this mean? What are they talking about? Basic human rights of Chinese workers." And then they even proposed some legislation calling on the president to support worker rights in China. Well, this is globalization acting in a positive way. And Mr. Chang says, well, while the companies want a lot, they still have what they think is a law that will do some good for Chinese workers. And we will see. The key thing in China, as elsewhere, is going to be, can you enforce the law, which was weakened from what they originally wanted? And I make no judgment whether the weakened or the strengthened version was better, but because the enforcement is ultimately going to be the thing. This will give you an idea of what the law does in China. And you can have a written contract. A lot of workers in China never had a written contract. Good job. And not having a written contract, they had no legal rights. So when the company would tell them, oh, by the way, I'm not paying you, they couldn't get their pay. And then we know that would not occur. And if you have a major corporation, presumably doesn't do that. They regulate how I could have you a probationary period for forever, which makes you a secondary, worker in the things. Can a worker refuse dangerous work? Well, they were not allowed to refuse dangerous work. Now they can. They may not be enforced again. So I just go down the things, and these are, I don't know, they're reasonable things that were put in the law that will strengthen. And each of these cases, there was a stronger provision, or most of them, there was a stronger provision that our corporations got out. But nonetheless, these are still things. And you want something that perhaps the corporations say they can live with, and they feel they bought into, because then it'll be easier to enforce. So we have standards now rising for the country with the largest workforce in the world, basically. I mean, India's got a lot more peasants and so on, but China's got the largest. Now, there was an interesting internet poll which said, do you believe that Chinese labor laws can protect labor rights? This is put on a particular China Labor Watch. You can download it. I mean, it's interesting, because internet poll, this is non-representative. I have no idea who answered it, but I assume at least there was people who went to this website. And this is not a terribly popular website. I don't really believe the Chinese government got people to, you could have filled it with totally erroneous things. And so it says here, 19% thought the law could do full protection. 39% thought it would give no protection at all. That's because of enforcement. And you see, it was 5,000 people, almost 5,000 people responded, and it's a fairly even division, I would say. If people think, well, it's not going to do any good, people think it will do some good, and you could do what you want about thinking about it, how it actually will be. And I have a much more positive view of in the end of this, because I think, so I took this little book that Kimberly Elliott and I wrote, which said, can labor standards improve under globalization, was our question. And I think the evidence is not only can, but they will improve. It just, there's a lot of work to do it. And people are, doing that kind of work. And it'll happen inside the countries, outside the countries. And without the globalization, I don't think there would be anything like the pressure being put on this. So I have a very positive view of what's going to happen in the end. Okay, I'm done with my discussion.